Okay, I think the biggest challenge of this video is going to be trying to lift up this stack of books to include in the thumbnail, so here goes. This is why I should not have given up weightlifting. Hi everyone, so we all know why we're here from the title of this video already. This is the 10 books on my TBR that I own physical copies of that I'm really the most intimidated by. Some of them have been on my TBR, I've had in my home for years now and still haven't read because for one reason or another I'm just a little bit intimidated to pick them up or carry on with them. Now, there's definitely a sort of consistent theme here. A lot of these are big books. I'm definitely intimidated, like many, by the big chunky books. But that's not the only reason some of these are in here, and some of them are actually quite manageable lengths, but perhaps because of reputation, because of hype, because of my association between the book and the author, and what I've heard from other people, I'm just a little bit nervous to get started. Now, this is obviously all in light-hearted spirit. I don't find books themselves particularly intimidating, but for one reason or another I obviously subconsciously haven't been reading these ones, and I think this is why, and I'd like to get into the nitty-gritty of it and talk about them, and maybe you could encourage me to finally give them a go. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So the first one on my list is actually one of the ones that's been on my TBR for the shortest amount of time. Not the one that's been on my TBR for the shortest amount of time, but definitely only since this year, and it was actually a gift from my lovely friend Ashley. It is of course the Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. So I think a lot of you are really surprised when I say I haven't read this book because it sounds exactly like the kind of book I'm constantly on the hunt for. It has two of my favourite things in terms of fantasy, and that is dragons and female-female romance. Like, that is my ideal scenario. But not only is this a chunky book that I have heard almost no bad things about, like genuinely this is one of the most highly praised fantasy I think to come out for the past few years. It is really well respected in terms of the writing, the world building. It's a slight retelling of the St. George legend or story of yore, and that's not something I'm that familiar with. It's been a big hit, shall we say. But like I said, it's pretty massive. It's got a ton of hype, so obviously I'm nervous because it sounds like I should love it and everyone thinks I'm going to love it, but because of that, that makes me a little bit nervous because what if I expect too much from it? On the other hand, however, and this is the only book that this applies to in this video, I'm a little bit nervous to read it because I myself just finished writing and editing a fantasy novel about dragons that features heavily as like a key point of female-female romance, because those are some of my favourite things in fantasy. Now, the plot of this book sounds completely different to my book, but I spent 2 years writing that book. I'm currently trying to seek representation for that book so that maybe I can get it published in the future, and because of that, I'm not scared that this will be similar, but I'm scared that this will make my book feel inadequate. I'm scared I'm going to read this book that everybody loves, that's like this massive epic fantasy about two women in love and dragons, and feel like, wow, my book can't compare. So that's the main reason I'm not picking this one up, and I'm a little bit ashamed to admit it. Like, I've always been a little bit fearful to say that online, that that's the reason I'm not reading this book, but there you have it. It's all coming out today, so I do want to read this, but that's the reason that I'm kind of nervous about picking it up. Actually, while we're on the topic of FF fantasy, another one of the books on this list falls under that category, and it's The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. Now, there's, again, two reasons that I'm kind of intimidated by this book. It is quite chunky, it's one of those like big format hardback novels, but in saying that, it's 462 pages, so it's not the most ridiculously long book in the history of books, but it's a book I have personally hyped up to a ridiculous level for myself. Like, I blame nobody else for the nervous anticipation that I have developed surrounding this book except myself. I was so excited when I found out this book was being released months and months and months before it was being released, so I couldn't get my hands on a copy, and I was so excited. It was one of my most anticipated releases. It sounds so good. It's a story about orcs, so the protagonists of this novel are orcs, and I love when magical creatures that are traditionally cast as the like bad guy in fantasy are given the protagonist role, and of course, like I mentioned, there's a central female-female romance, so it sounds absolutely like the kind of book I would love, but I really like went hard on hyping this up, both for myself and everybody else, because I know people have picked this up on my recommendation, despite the fact that I haven't read it, but because I mentioned I was excited for it. And because of that, I'm so scared to read it, because I really like have set these expectations for myself. Like, I am entirely to blame for this one. I also think the author is really fantastic. Like, I follow her online, and if I follow an author online and I really like their personality and the kind of stuff that they share and talk about online, then it does make me all the more excited to read their book as well. I think that's something that we all experience. But yeah, I've kind of really hyped this one up in my head, so let me know if you have read it and what you thought of it, and help me just like get excited but in a manageable way, because that would be really helpful. We then have one of the shortest books on this list, because this book is, yes, a hardback, as I'm about to show you, but it's only 318 pages. And that's Paradise by Toni Morrison. So I know that this isn't necessarily the most famous Toni Morrison book. I feel like maybe The Bluest Eye, is that what it's called, is the one I always hear about. But I picked this one up in a second-hand bookshop, so this was the one they had and this was the one I decided to go for. And the reason I'm really intimidated by this is because of the praise surrounding Toni Morrison. Like, Toni Morrison is one of the most like beloved authors, I feel, of like the 20th and early 21st centuries. She comes so highly recommended. Her books have such an impact. They are taught in schools and in universities, and I know that they're often, if not always, quite sad. Like, I think she deals with quite serious, heavy, forlorn topics in her novels, and I believe that is true of Paradise as well. So although I really want to read Toni Morrison and to understand her as an author and all of this praise that surrounds her, I'm kind of nervous because of all of that praise, because she's so highly regarded and because her works have so much impact, and also because they're quite sad. I have to be in the right frame of mind as it is to read a sad book, but a sad book by an author who is so well loved is just that little bit more intimidating, I feel. And also sometimes I do wonder if I'm starting with the wrong book. Like, should I be reading a different Toni Morrison book first? Is Paradise the right one? I picked this one up on a whim. Maybe I should have gone for something else. But it's all in my head, you know, when you're just like literally making up this kind of like, you look at that book and think, oh, I know everyone loves it, but that's scary. You know when you just look on a book and, you know when you just look on a book, you know when you just look at a book on your bookshelf and think, that sounds brilliant, but I'm scared to read it. That's kind of how I feel about this. Obviously, like I said, I do have to be in the right frame of mind to read something I think that's going to be so hard-hitting and quite sad, but at the same time, even when I've sort of been in that mood, I haven't picked this one up yet. I only got it this year, so I've not really had it that long. But Toni Morrison is generally an author that I've always wanted to read, but kind of been a little bit nervous to pick up. So I felt like this was still appropriate for the video. We then have a book that's been on my TBR much longer than the other ones I've shown you thus far. In fact, I got this when it first came out. So the year this book was published was 2015. So it's been on my TBR for 5 years, and I did start it once. I actually got quite a few chapters in. I maybe read like 50 pages or maybe more. Like, I felt like I read like a reasonable amount of it, but probably never past page 100. And it is a book that is over 600 pages, so it's quite long. It's also a massive hardback. And really, like, I probably just shouldn't acquire big long books in hardback format, because this is like an intimidating format, I think, because it looks all the bigger. And it's also just like quite cumbersome to read. Like, I think it's stunning. It's a naked hardback with this gorgeous cutout design. Beautiful, but not the easiest to read. Like, it's not that easy to put in your bag or cart around. It can sort of be a bit of a weight on your wrist. So for that reason, I'm also less inclined to pick it up. And it also just sounds quite dense. So from what I read of this book and what I've heard of this book, it's multiple perspective, and multiple perspective stories really have to be done the right kind of way for me. There's probably lots of right ways to do a multiple perspective story, but there's only so many ways that I enjoy them, and I think they can also be quite dense and a little bit more confusing because you're jumping around between different characters. Not only that, this book, however, jumps around between characters, jumps around between times because the characters are in different times, and also jumps around between like worlds and like alternative universes and fictional characters and real characters. So it's like you're following characters in books within the world, and that's kind of what I remember from it, and you have no idea how it's all going to tie together. So that's a little bit intimidating in itself. I know my friend Jen loved this book. It's like a blend of sci-fi and fantasy, so I can only really describe it as speculative because it kind of encompasses both of those genres. And like I said, I know my friend Jen absolutely adored this book, but because of the size and all of the perspectives and because of the praise and how much Jen loved it at the time, I'm a little bit nervous to like really get cracking with it. It's Arcadia by Ian Pierce. Part of me thinks I didn't say that, but now you know. Whilst we're on the topic that books have been on my TBR for a long time, this one has definitely been on my TBR the longest, and if you've been watching my channel since the very conception, since 2013 when I picked myself up a copy of this book, then you will not be surprised to see it here because it is, yes, The Decameron by Giovanni Boccaccio. This is an Italian medieval classic that I really want to read. Like, I have that desire, you know, to know the story, to experience the story, yet that desire never compels me quite enough to actually read the book. This is not only a chunky paperback, this is over 600 pages, but it's minuscule font. I feel as though were this printed in less of a minuscule font, it would be like 1,000 pages long. And I bet those editions exist because this is tiny font and still a huge book. And that's scary in itself. It's also like a compilation of lots of stories, because what this book is about is a group of friends during the plague in Italy, in Florence, who go off together to wait out the plague in a sort of countryside manor house, and they while away their days and entertain each other by telling stories. And I have started this book a couple of times in the past and read a couple of stories, but never got any further. Not because I didn't like it, but because it is big, it is dense, it's medieval literature, so as much as I harp on about the accessibility of classical literature, I still think there's something that doesn't flow exactly the same about older literature than more modern literature in terms of what I'm used to reading, so it definitely requires a little bit more of my attention to sort of get into the zone of medieval literature, which is also something I've really not read much of. Like, obviously I've read a ton of ancient classical literature, tons and tons, read plenty of modern literature. Medieval is a bit of a gap in my reading, and this is one of the medieval literature pieces that is highest up on my TBR, yet for some reason it's still 7 years later and I have not gotten further than 50 pages. So I will keep putting this book in TBRs, I will keep it on my shelf until I finally pick it up, because one day I will. We then have one that doesn't actually look that big, but again, tiny font, and actually is quite thin paper, so it's around 500 pages long despite being mass market paperback. And that is The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. This is the lovely film tie-in edition. And there's a few reasons this one intimidates me slightly. One, again, it is quite long. Like, it's not the longest book. 500 pages isn't the longest thing in the world, but it is quite long and densely packed with text. It's also a book that just has so much praise. Like, so many people love this book, and I feel like I would love it as well. The framing of it reads quite dense, and I have started it a few times. This actually has an old receipt in here from when I tried to read it before, that I received from shopping in Primark in 2014, so apparently I tried to read this book 6 years ago. Just keep that one. What did I buy? Something apparently called a dinosaur tee. Don't remember ever owning a t-shirt with a dinosaur in it, but apparently I did. A vest, and gingham check something with literally no more information than that. So yeah, like I said, I have started this in the past. It is a crime novel set in the medieval period, although it's not written in the medieval period, it was from the 20th century. It has a lot of praise, especially if you like detective fiction, and there was certainly something about the relationship between the detective and the narrator that gave me slight Sherlock Holmes vibes when I started it. Again, like I said, it's framed as if it's a true story, like it's got this sort of framing device from what I understand. And not only is it just generally hyped, like some of my best friends off the internet who I don't know because we are readers online love this book, but it was also one of my dad's favourites, and my dad was always telling me, read this book, you'll love this book. Read this book, you'll love this book, Jean, this is completely the kind of book you'll love. I love this book, I love Umberto Eco, Umberto Eco is fantastic, and you will also love him. And I think it's kind of scary sort of picking up something that I know my dad loved, and the expectations that that places on that book, and also the fact that I've left it, I mean I'm not having a go at myself, but I've left it to a point where I now can't talk about it with him because my dad passed away in 2017. So although I obviously tried to start it in 2014, it just maybe wasn't the right time, and now when I do read this I won't be able to talk about it with him. So it feels like this book that I have such high expectations for that I probably am going to adore, but will probably take me a little while to read. And then I've also sort of missed that opportunity, which is true of lots of the books on my dad's bookshelves, and in a way it's also incredibly lucky that I have all those books, and even though my dad's not here I can still experience reading his favourite books and perhaps discover what he loved about them. But I do miss that I won't be able to talk about it with him, and I also really hope I love it and don't end up not liking it and being like, oh my god, I'm really sorry, both to my father and everyone else that seems to love it, because I honestly haven't heard a bad thing. So yeah, this is definitely intimidating. The most recent book to make it onto this TBR probably also doesn't come as a surprise to any of you, and that is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. Now, I really don't want to leave this book the length of time I have left some of the other books I've shown you, because I literally just got this in the post and it literally just came out over the past month as well. It is Christopher Paolini's first novel set outside of Allegasia, which is the fantasy world that he created for his Inheritance cycle, and it's also a sci-fi novel despite the previous books he read, which are all set in Allegasia, being fantasy. So first novel outside of that world and first sci-fi novel to be published. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, then you probably also know that Eragon, the Inheritance cycle, is one of my favourite series of books of all time. I have reread all the books in that series multiple times. I adore them, I adore the world building, and all the books in that series are huge. Like, those are huge books, and that is the one thing that I find encouraging, because I know that although his books are huge, they still manage to capture my attention throughout the whole span. In saying that, however, I'm nervous that I won't have the same feelings about this, because obviously those mean so much to me and I hold those in such high regard, and they're such chunky books about worlds that I wish I could visit, that I'm a little bit intimidated to pick up this over 900 page book in a slightly different genre by one of my favourite authors, but also an author who I've never read anything that isn't set in Allegasia by. So that's like kind of scary. I mean, it's probably incredibly scary for him to have your first book come out that's not set in a world that is so beloved. Like, that's quite an intimidating publishing endeavour, and I'm not saying that this book won't be excellent in its own right, but like I said, I have such fond memories of Eragon and the rest of the books in the series that I'm slightly intimidated to pick this up, because I want to love it, and sometimes hyping things up to that extent in your own head is a little bit detrimental, because then you do become a little bit worried that they won't live up to that hype. But I would love to hear if you've read this, because obviously it's quite new out and I kind of want to wait and see what the reviews are saying, and that might help mellow me out a little bit. So let me know if you've picked this up yet. Two more books, however, and the next one is actually non-fiction. So I have a lot of non-fiction books on my TBR that I want to read, but I wouldn't necessarily say I'm that intimidated by them. Most of them look, from when I was looking at my bookcases, to be quite manageable lengths. I just have to be in the right headspace to pick them up and in the right like mood and interested in the topic. But one that I do really want to read and would like to read quite soon, I picked up at the beginning of this year and I'm a little bit intimidated by, is The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which is subtitled The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. So the focus of this book on surveillance capitalism is discussing the way that capitalism has changed in the sort of technological age, is talking about ad targeting, data mining, the way that all of our information is out there online and how that affects our shopping and what that means for us as consumers and how it affects the sort of capitalist structure of society, because we don't live in the same kind of capitalist world that we did 100 years ago. This is a very different world, and it needs to be manoeuvred in a different way, and especially if you're anti-capitalist, which I would consider myself, although I exist in a capitalist society, and I've never been one to really hold individuals responsible for the fact that they simply exist in a capitalist society, but I think there's a lot of detrimental things about capitalism and how it affects people's lives and the way we treat other human beings. So it's obviously something I want to be continuously reading about in order to sort of bring it into my politics and the way I sort of approach politics. And most of the traditional sort of anti-capitalist texts obviously could never have predicted the kind of world that we exist in now. So I think this sounds like such a pivotal read, but it's a little bit scary because obviously it's going to deal with like the economy and economical issues as well as political issues. It's also going to deal with technology, but obviously just feel a little bit nervous to jump head first into it. I'd love to hear if you've read this book and sort of what your background knowledge was and how you found the accessibility of it. I have seen the author of this book speak briefly on an online video, or was it a podcast? I definitely heard her speak, and she did seem to approach it in a very accessible way, but it is a big book, so it's a little bit scary. I don't have a lot of non-fiction books this size on my shelf, so it's also not the one I immediately gravitate towards when I'm in a non-fiction mood. It's around 550 pages, so yeah, again, I really feel like hearing from all of you would be really helpful in terms of encouraging me to pick this up. Then last but not least, it's not a book that's entirely on this list because of its size. It's not too big. How big are you? It's around 500 pages, so it's not short, but it's not way long for a fiction book, and that is The Clan of the Cave Bear, which is book 1 in the Earth's Children series. And the reason this is on my sort of intimidating books TBR is there's a few actually. One is obviously it's, you know, not small, 500 pages, so I do tend to steer towards books under 400 pages when I'm just casually picking things off my bookcase. It's not even really a conscious decision, but that is kind of what I do. But it's also because this is the first in a 6-part series. I think it's either the 3rd or the 4th book in particular is huge, so it might even be like closer to like 800 pages. Like, the books just get bigger. So not only am I sort of reading one book of 500 pages if I pick this up, I'm sort of committing myself, if I like them, to reading a book series that is thousands of pages in total, which is a good thing obviously if I like this book, but it feels like a commitment. I also have heard amazing things. I also have both heard amazing things about this book and hyped it up in my head because it's a historical fiction set in the prehistoric era when Neanderthals still existed. So that is another reason that I've been so intrigued by it. Like, how much historical fiction is written about Neanderthals? Very little from what I understand, but I loved studying the prehistoric period at university and I find it very interesting. So I feel like I could love a book set in that period, and that makes me a little bit nervous because there's not a lot of books set in this period, and if I don't love this one, I'm going to be pretty disappointed. So yeah, of course these are all slightly arbitrary reasons. You could easily just say, Jane, just pick these books up, you think you're going to like them, and if you don't, you don't, it's not the end of the world. But for one reason or another, they're always ones that I go, no, I'm going to read a 300-page book that's a little bit easier and it's a standalone and it doesn't feel like a big commitment. So I'd love to hear from you if you've read any of these, if you could maybe help me find that motivation to finally pick them up, because I do think they'll sound fantastic. That's why they're on my TBR, and perhaps just provide a little bit of reassurance in general. I'd also love to hear what the most intimidating books on your TBR, whether it's because of the length, whether it's because of the reviews and the hype, or your expectations around a certain author. Let me know in the comments down below. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!